There is a detail in the Bible so precise it almost sounds like a dare. A king's bed, iron, 13.5 feet long, 6 feet wide. The ancient writer didn't say giant. He gave you measurements, as if to say, go find it. Go verify. This is not a story. This is a coordinate. That king was Og of Bashan, last of the Rephaim, and his bed was not the strangest thing about him. The strangest thing is that he existed at all, because the flood was supposed to end this. God looked at a world corrupted beyond repair, a world where boundaries between human and divine had been violated, where violence had become the air, people grieved, and he pressed reset. 40 days of water, a civilization erased, 8 survivors carried forward. It should have been over. But when the waters pulled back and dry land emerged again, something else emerged with it. They were back. Not one group, not one bloodline. 5 distinct races of giants, each with a name, each occupying a specific territory, each positioned, and this is what the scholars don't emphasize enough, exactly where God's people were destined to walk. That is not coincidence. That is a message. The Rephaim, the Anakim, the Emim, the Zuzim, the Zamzumim. Say those names slowly. Let them sit for a moment. Because these are not myth. They are not borrowed from Mesopotamian legend or Greek imagination. They are recorded in the biblical text with the same matter-of-fact precision used to describe borders, genealogies, and land grants. And yet for centuries, theologians softened them. Academics explained them away. Commentaries rushed past them toward safer ground. Why? Because if you take these 5 races seriously, if you follow the thread where it actually leads, you end up somewhere deeply uncomfortable. You end up asking not just who were they, but why were they there? And who sent them? Here is what I believe, and I want to be honest that this is my reading, my angle, shaped by years of sitting inside these texts. The giants after the flood were not a biological accident. They were a response, a counter-move in a conflict that began before the first human being drew breath. And that conflict is still running. Tonight, we are not going to romanticize these beings. We are not going to build mythology around them. We are going to do something harder and more rewarding. We are going to read the Bible the way it was written, precisely, unflinchingly, and let it say what it actually says. This is the untold story of the 5 races of giants after the flood. And it begins with a question no one around you is asking. If God flooded the earth to destroy corruption, why did the giants survive? You found this channel for a reason. We don't do surface level here. We go into the text, into the history, into the questions that keep theologians up at night, and we bring it back to you in a way that actually means something. So if this is your first time here, stay close. And if you've been here before, you already know. Let's go. Before we name the 5 races, we have to understand the world they were born into. Because the flood did not happen in a vacuum. It was an answer, a judicial response to something that had been building for generations, a contamination so deep it had reached the structural level of humanity itself. The book of Genesis describes it in language that is almost clinical in its restraint. The earth was corrupt. The earth was filled with violence. Every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil, all the time. That word corrupt in Hebrew, shashith, means more than moral failure. It means ruin beyond its intended design. Like a blueprint that has been so heavily redrawn it no longer resembles the original. Something fundamental had been broken. Not just behavior, nature. And the text points us to where that breaking began. Genesis 6. The sons of God, the daughters of men. A union that was never meant to happen. Children born from it who became the mighty men of old, the men of renown, the Nephilim. Theologians have debated for centuries what exactly this passage means. I am not going to pretend that debate is settled. But I will tell you what the ancient readers of this text understood, and what Second Temple Jewish literature, the Book of Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and early church fathers consistently affirmed. Something crossed a line it was never permitted to cross. And the result walked the earth as a living violation of the boundary between the human and the divine. The flood was God's response to that violation. And here is where the story gets interesting and deeply unsettling. The flood worked. The Nephilim of the pre-flood world were gone. The corrupted civilization was erased. Noah and his family stepped off the ark on a wet, silent ground. A rainbow was placed in the sky as a covenant promise. It felt like morning after a long, terrible night. But the rebellion had produced the giants, the spiritual current running underneath, that was not drowned. You cannot drown an ideology. You cannot flood a temptation. You cannot wash away a cosmic intention with water. And so, with disturbing speed, the giants appear again. Not immediately. The early post-flood generations read quietly. Genealogies, nations forming, languages dividing at Babel. But then, as the narrative accelerates and the promised land begins to take shape, there they are, embedded in the geography, planted across the landscape like dark flags. The Rephaim, highlands of Bashan and Transjordan. The Anakim in the hill country of Canaan, centered around Hebron. The Emim in the territory that would become Moab. The Zuzim east of the Jordan, in the region of Ham. The Zamzumim in the lands later claimed by Ammon. 5 peoples. 5 territories. 5 spiritual strongholds positioned like a gauntlet across the very path God's people would need to walk. Now I wonder, pause here and share something that I think gets missed entirely in most treatments of this subject. The ancient world had a theology of geography. Land was not neutral. Territories were believed to be under the governance of spiritual powers, administrators of a kind, beings assigned to nations and regions. The book of Deuteronomy hints at this directly when it speaks of God dividing the nations according to the number of the sons of God. The book of Daniel makes it explicit. A heavenly prince of Persia resists the angelic messenger for 21 days, and a prince of Greece is waiting in the wings. In this framework, the giants are not just big people living on strategic land. They are the physical manifestation of a spiritual occupation. Their presence in those specific territories is a declaration. This land is under a different authority. This ground does not belong to the covenant. Come here, and you will not just face warriors, you will face a world ordered against you. That reframes everything. When the Israelite scouts go into Canaan and return trembling, they are not simply reporting on military strength. They are reporting on the atmosphere, the weight of what sits over that land, the sense that the invisible architecture of the place has been built to crush faith and magnify fear. We were like grasshoppers in our own eyes. That is not a description of height. That is a description of spiritual oppression. And it nearly worked. An entire nation, freed from Egypt, sustained by manna, guided by a pillar of fire, stood at the edge of everything God had promised them and turned back. Not because the giants defeated them in battle, but because the giants defeated them in their minds. This is the first and most important lesson embedded in the post-flood giant narrative. The giants do not need to win. They only need to make you believe they already have. That belief, that specific lie, is older than the flood. It survived the flood, and it is still operating today with the same precision it used in the wilderness of Sinai. But here is what gives me hope when I sit inside this text. The land still fell, not in the generation that trembled, but in the next one. Under Joshua, with a people who had lived long enough in the wilderness to stop trusting in what they could see and start trusting in what they had been promised, the giants fell. One by one, territory by territory. Not because Israel became more powerful, but because Israel finally stopped measuring themselves against the giants and started measuring the giants against God. That shift from grasshopper to covenant heir is the turning point of the entire narrative. And it begins not with a sword, but with a decision about whose report you are going to believe. Most people who have heard of biblical giants know one name, Goliath. Maybe two, if they've read further. Og of Bashan, the king with the iron bed. But the biblical record doesn't give us one giant or two. It gives us 5 distinct peoples, each with a name, each occupying specific territory, each carrying a spiritual signature that goes far beyond physical size. These are not interchangeable. They are not variations of the same story told 5 times. Each of the 5 post-flood giant races represents a distinct expression of the same underlying rebellion, and when you line them up together, a pattern emerges that is almost architectural in its precision. Let's go through them one by one. Slowly, the way the text deserves. The Rephaim. Their name is the starting point, and it is immediately strange. Rephaim in Hebrew carries a double meaning that no translation fully captures. In some contexts it refers to towering physical beings, warriors of legendary size. In others, particularly in the poetic books, it refers to the shades of the dead, the silent inhabitants of Sheol, the realm beneath. Why would the same word describe both giants and ghosts? The ancient reader would not have found this confusing.
Yes.
They would have understood it as a statement about origin and destiny. The Rephaim are beings who exist at the border, between the living and the dead, between the human and something older and darker. They are the visible remnant of a world god buried underwater, still walking around in the daylight. Their most famous representative is Og, king of Bashan. And the text about him does something deliberately jarring. It interrupts the military narrative to tell us about his bed. Iron frame, approximately 13.5 feet long, still on display in Rabbah of the Ammonites at the time of writing, as if the author is saying, this is verifiable. Go, look. Bashan itself is significant. It sits in the region north and east of the Sea of Galilee, a high volcanic plateau of ancient black basalt. In Canaanite religion, Bashan was associated with the serpent, with the underworld, with the domain of the dead. Mount Hermon, the peak that towers over Bashan, is identified in the Book of Enoch as the very mountain where the sons of God descended and made their forbidden oath. Og ruling Bashan is not an accident of real estate. It is a theological statement. The last king of the Rephaim sits enthroned in the most spiritually charged territory in the ancient Near East. The Anakim. If the Rephaim represent origin, the Anakim represent impact. No other giant race in the biblical narrative produces the kind of psychological devastation that the Anakim produce. When the 12 spies return from their reconnaissance mission and 10 of them collapse into despair, it is specifically the Anakim they cannot stop talking about. The descendants of Anakim from the Nephilim. That is the connection the spies make. They are not just big. They are that kind of big. The kind that reaches back before the flood. The kind that carries in its bloodline the memory of a violation that God once judged with water. Their stronghold is Hebron, and this too is not random. Hebron is where Abraham is buried, where the patriarchal promise was first spoken over the land, where God appeared to Abraham and said this, all of this is for your descendants. The Anakim did not stumble into Hebron. They planted themselves on the most sacred, patriarchal ground in Canaan, as if to say, that promise, we are the answer to it. Come and take it if you dare. The psychological warfare embedded in their location is breathtaking when you see it clearly. Every time an Israelite remembered the covenant promise attached to Hebron, they also had to picture the Anakim standing on it. Faith and terror, anchored to the same coordinates. The Emim. Their name translates simply as the terrifying ones. And the biblical account of them is sparse enough to be haunting. We know they were tall, described as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. We know they occupied the territory of Moab before the Moabites displaced them. And we know that the Moabites, not a people celebrated for timidity, called the Emim, the ones who made them feel afraid. Think about that. A people so formidable that the nation that replaced them named them after the emotion they produced. Not after their king. Not after their city. After their effect. The Emim teach us something about how giants operate that goes beyond the physical. Terror is a theology. When an entire population organizes its imagination around the impossibility of resistance, the giant has already won the most important battle, the one flood, before any army takes the field. The Zuzim. They appear briefly, almost as a footnote in Genesis 14, the chapter describing the war of the 4 kings against 5. They are mentioned as one of the peoples attacked by the coalition of eastern kings sweeping through the Transjordan. Brief as their appearance is, it tells us something important. The Zuzim were present at the dawn of the patriarchal era, already embedded in the landscape before Abraham had fully arrived. They are the reminder that the giant occupation of the promised land was not a late development. It was established, entrenched, generational. They are the ones history barely remembers, and perhaps that is itself the point. Not every expression of the rebellion is dramatic. Some of it is quiet, structural, woven so deeply into the fabric of a place that it becomes invisible. The Zuzim are the giants you don't see until you're already surrounded. The Zamzumim. The final name. And in some ways the most instructive. The Zamzumim occupied the territory that later became Ammon. They were, by all accounts, as formidable as the others, great and numerous and tall. And yet they are the only giant race in the biblical record whose fall is attributed not to Israel, but to the Ammonites themselves. God drove them out, the text says, before the Ammonites, who dispossessed the land, settled in their place. This is quietly extraordinary. The Zamzumim, seemingly invincible, were dismantled by a people that the rest of the ancient world would not have considered a great military power. And they disappeared. Their territory absorbed. Their name surviving only as a memory attached to a land they no longer held. The Zamzumim are the biblical record's clearest statement that the power of giants is not inherent. It is permitted. And when the permission is withdrawn, the fall is sudden and total. 5 races, 5 territories, 5 spiritual signatures, violence without restraint, terror as a weapon, pride rooted in forbidden origin, invisible influence, power that looks permanent but collapses overnight. Lay them side by side and you are not reading about ancient warriors. You are reading a map of the human heart under rebellion, every form that resistance to God takes when it organizes itself into a civilization. And here is the personal note I want to leave you with before we go further. Every one of us has stood at the edge of a promise and seen Anakim on the horizon. Every one of us has felt the Emim effect, that oppressive sense, that resistance is pointless, that the territory ahead belongs to something too large to challenge. The biblical invitation is not to pretend the giants aren't real. Joshua and Caleb never denied the size of the enemy. Their faith was not naivety. It was a different calculation, one that factored in a variable that 10 trembling spies had subtracted from the equation entirely: the presence of God. When you add that back in, the math changes completely. If this chapter is opening something for you, a question, a memory, a moment when you stood at the edge of your own promised land and turned back, write it below. You don't have to have answers. Just write it. Because sometimes naming the giant is the first step toward watching it fall. There is a moment in the Exodus story that doesn't get enough attention. The people of Israel have just witnessed 10 plagues. They walked through a sea on dry ground. They watched the most powerful military force in the ancient world swallowed by water behind them. They have seen fire by night and cloud by day. They have eaten bread that appeared on the ground every morning like a gift left at their doorstep by an invisible hand. And then they hear a report about giants. And they want to go back to Egypt.
God,
not quietly, not with hesitation. They weep aloud. They accuse Moses of leading them to their deaths. They begin talking seriously about appointing a new leader, someone who will take them back to the place where they were slaves, where their sons were drowned in the Nile, where their backs were broken under the weight of Pharaoh's ambition. They would rather be slaves than face giants. I have read that passage dozens of times and it still stops me cold. Because it is not a story about cowardice.
It's impossible.
It is a story about what happens when fear becomes more real to you than promise. When the thing you can see with your eyes completely overwhelms the thing you have been given by covenant. The 10 spies did not lie. That is the part that makes this so theologically precise. The giants were real. The cities were fortified. The military challenge was genuine. Joshua and Caleb did not dispute any of that. They saw the same landscape. They measured the same walls. They looked at the same towering figures. But they came back with a different report. The land is exceedingly good. If the Lord delights in us, He will bring us into this land and give it to us.
I have seen the land.
Do not fear the people of the land.
He sees
Their
the gaps,
protection has departed from
the
them.
hollow spaces around
Same
the giant.
giants, same walls,
He stands alone.
same impossible odds. Completely different conclusion. What was the variable? It was not information.
Storm approaches.
Both groups
Our
had
time is
identical
running
information.
Nonsense.
It
Look
was not
closer.
courage
The
in the
signs are
conventional
good.
sense,
Victory is
as
at
if
hand.
Joshua and Caleb were simply braver men who happened to be less affected by fear. No. The variable was theological. It was what they believed about the nature of the conflict they were entering. The 10 spies framed the battle as a contest between two armies. Israel versus the giants. Small versus large. Weak versus strong. In that framing, the conclusion is obvious and the 10 spies are simply being rational. Joshua and Caleb framed it differently. They understood that Israel was not the primary actor in this story. God was. And the question was not whether Israel could defeat the giants. The question was whether the giants could withstand the God who had already claimed that land by covenant, promise. That reframing is everything. And it is the reframing that the enemy, whatever spiritual intelligence stood behind the giant occupation of Canaan, was most desperate to prevent. Because, here is what I find deeply instructive when I sit inside this narrative. The giants did not attack the Israelites in the wilderness. They didn't need to. The 10 spies did more damage to Israel's momentum than any Anakim warrior could have done with a sword.
I saw
One
them.
report,
They're like giants.
delivered
You
with
cannot
emotion
defeat
and
them.
apparent credibility,
Look, he's right.
and an
Turn
entire
back.
nation reversed
No.
direction.
No,
This is the most sophisticated weapon in the arsenal of anything that wants to block you from your destiny. Not force. Narrative. Control the story a person tells about themselves. Make them see themselves as grasshoppers, as victims, as people to whom the good things were never really meant to happen, and you have won without raising a hand. The wilderness generation lived out the consequences of that narrative for 40 years. They wandered. They complained. They died one by one in the desert, within sight of the land they had been promised, unable to enter because the story they believed about themselves had become a prison more effective than any Egyptian chain.
Some scars.
And here is
you
the
wear on
part
the
that
inside.
breaks my heart every
They never
time
truly
I
heal.
read it carefully. God did not abandon them in the wilderness. He stayed. The manna kept coming. The cloud and fire kept leading. The covenant was not revoked. But a generation that chose the grasshopper narrative over the covenant narrative could not receive what the covenant was offering. Not because God withheld it, but because faith is not just a feeling. It is a posture of the will, a decision about whose report you are going to build your life on. 40 years later, a new generation stood at the same threshold. They had grown up hearing the stories. They knew about the giants. They had watched their parents choose Egypt in their hearts even while their bodies wandered in the wilderness. And now it was their turn. What changed? The giants hadn't shrunk. The cities of Canaan were still fortified. The Anakim still held Hebron. By every external measurement, the situation facing Joshua's generation was identical to what their parents had encountered. But something internal had shifted. A generation raised on the stories of God's faithfulness, even in a wilderness, even in failure, even in judgment, had developed a different baseline. They had learned, slowly and painfully, that God does not abandon His word, even when His people abandon their faith. And so when Joshua led them across the Jordan, into the territory of the giants, the narrative changes tone almost immediately. The language becomes terse, almost businesslike. And they took it. And they destroyed it. And they gave it as an inheritance. No romanticization. No epic battle poetry. The text does not linger on the drama of the victories. It simply records them as facts, as the natural outcome of a people finally aligned with the covenant that had always been heirs. Hebron fell to Caleb, the man who had given the minority report 45 years earlier, now 85 years old, walked up to Joshua and said something remarkable. "Give me this mountain."
The Hebron
The
fortress
Anakim
stands tall,
are there and the
giants
cities are
upon the
great and
walls.
fortified.
We see them, Caleb.
But if the Lord is with me, I shall drive them out.
Ahead,
45 years of
and
waiting,
it is clear.
45 years of watching a generation die in the wilderness around him, carrying a promise he was not yet permitted to claim. And when the moment finally came,
We should choose
Caleb
the
did
easier
not
regions.
ask for an
No,
easy
this one has a
inheritance.
stronghold.
He
I will
asked
take this
for
mountain.
the hardest one, the one with giants on it, because by that point, the giants were not the point. The promise was the point. And that shift from giant-focused to promise-focused is the entire psychological and spiritual journey the book of Joshua is trying to take us on.
Look at them.
It is the
Look at
journey
them.
from grasshopper to air,
They're giants.
from we cannot
God is with
to he
us.
will, from a report shaped by fear to a report shaped by covenant. And it is
The
a
truth,
journey,
when it's
I would
finally
suggest,
holds
that is
more
never
weight
simply
than we ever
ancient
imagined.
history. Every generation faces its version of the 12 spies moment. Every soul stands at some threshold where the giants look real and the promise looks fragile. The question the biblical narrative asks, quietly, insistently, across every chapter, is the same question it asked in the wilderness of Sinai: whose report will you believe? There is a pattern in the Bible that is easy to miss if you are reading too fast. Every time giants appear in the physical landscape, something parallel is happening in the political landscape. The two are never unconnected. The spiritual occupation of territory and the corruption of human authority move together, like shadows cast by the same source of darkness. We have spent 3 chapters looking at giants as warriors, as occupiers of land, as architects of psychological terror. Now we need to look at something more subtle and in many ways more dangerous. What happens when the giant stops standing outside the gate and starts sitting on the throne? This is not a metaphor I am inventing. The biblical narrative builds it deliberately,
Truth.
brick by brick, across centuries of history. It begins with a warning. When Israel finally settled in the land, looks around at the nations surrounding them and decides and wants a king, God's response is telling. He doesn't simply refuse. He says something more precise. They have not rejected you.
The words
They
are
have
clear.
rejected me from being king over
The
them.
subject has
And then he gives them exactly what they asked for. Saul. The text introduces Saul with a
The lost
description
decree.
that lands like a theological alarm bell if you know what you are reading.
It's Saul.
There was not a man among the people
Head
of
and
Israel more
shoulders
handsome
above his
than he.
people.
From his shoulders
Time
upward
has
he was
come to
taller than
choose
any
our
of the
path.
people. Taller than any of the people. The first king of Israel is chosen partly, the narrative strongly implies, because
We are
he
in
looked the
agreement.
part. He was
Your endorsement
impressive
is
by the
appreciated.
standards the surrounding
Our nations
nations used
stand
to
with you.
evaluate greatness. He was, in the most literal sense available to the text, giant adjacent. A man whose authority was legible in his height, whose kingship could be read in his appearance before he ever made a single decision. And the kingdom built on that foundation collapses. Not immediately. These things rarely collapse immediately. But the rot sets in early, and it follows a precise
come to me.
path. Saul begins to make decisions based
Speak,
on
Lord.
what the people want rather than
Your
what
will be
God
done.
commands. He begins to treat the covenant as a framework to be managed rather than an
time is
authority
at
to be
hand.
obeyed. He begins to fear the crowd more than he fears God. The giant ideal, power justified by appearance, authority measured by impressiveness, leadership validated by the approval of those being led, has climbed onto the throne of Israel and begun its quiet work of hollowing it out from within. By the time Goliath appears in a valley of Elah, the situation is almost perfectly symmetrical. On one side of the valley, a giant, a Philistine warrior 9 feet tall, armored in bronze, carrying a spear with a shaft like a weaver's beam. His armor alone weighed 125 pounds. He has been defying the armies of Israel for 40 days, twice a day, morning and evening, with the methodical confidence of someone who already knows how the story ends. On the other side, an army paralyzed, a king hiding in his tent,
Come out and fight!
a nation that has spent years watching a giant-hearted king slowly surrender his authority to fear and opinion, and has now encountered an actual giant and has no idea what to do. The external giant and the internal giant have synchronized. And then a boy rides from Bethlehem carrying bread and cheese for his brothers. David has no armor. He has no military record. He is the youngest of 8 sons, the one left tending sheep while his brothers stood in the battle lines. By every measurable criterion, he is the wrong person for this moment. But David has something the army of Israel has forgotten and the king of Israel has surrendered. He has a frame of reference that makes Goliath small. Not because David is naive about the danger. He has killed a lion and a bear with his hands while protecting his father's sheep. He understands violence. He understands what it costs to stand between something precious and something that wants to destroy it. He is not walking into that valley on innocent ignorance. He is walking in on theological memory. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine.
Come down here,
That
boy,
sentence
and
is the
face
entire
your
sermon.
I come to you
That
in the
sentence
name of the Lord
contains
of hosts.
everything the wilderness generation forgot and everything Joshua's generation had to relearn. The God who was faithful in the small hidden moments, in the field, with the sheep, where no one was watching, is the same God who stands in the valley of public confrontation. David's confidence is not in his ability. It is in a track record that belongs to someone else. And Goliath falls. One stone. One moment. A giant that had paralyzed an entire army for 40 days is on the ground before the echo of his own voice has finished bouncing off the valley walls. The speed of it is theologically important. The biblical narrative does not give Goliath a heroic death. It does not slow down to honor his final moments. He falls, and the narrative moves on. Because the point was never Goliath. The point was always the question his presence was forcing Israel to answer. Who rules here? And David's answer, delivered not in words but in a single smooth stone, was, not you. Now I want to draw a line from that valley to something closer, to our own moment.
The connection between the stones
Because
of the
the
past
pattern the Bible
and the challenges
establishes
of
here
today
does not stay in
is
the
surprisingly
ancient world.
clear.
It is written into the architecture of how power works and how it corrupts. Every generation produces its version of the giant on the throne. Leaders who mistake impressiveness for integrity. Institutions that mistake size for righteousness. Systems that confuse the appearance of strength with the substance of justice. The giant on the throne does not always wear armor. Sometimes it wears a suit. Sometimes it wears religious robes. Sometimes it speaks in the language of progress or tradition or national destiny. But the fingerprint is always the same. Power that refuses accountability. Authority that silences questioning. greatness that feeds on the
Repent,
smallness
you
of others.
merchants of greed.
The biblical prophets spent their
power
careers
is
confronting
fleeting,
exactly this.
and your wealth is
Amos
a curse
thundering
upon
against
this.
merchants who sold a poor for a pair of sandals. Isaiah mocking kings who trusted in horses and chariots. Jeremiah weeping over a nation that had exchanged the living God for systems of control dressed up as worship. They were not simply social critics. They were
come to me
doing
with
what
sword
David
and
did in the
spear.
Valley of Elah, refusing
to
to
you in the
accept
name
the
of the
giant's
Lord
framing of
Almighty.
the situation. Refusing to concede that because something was large and entrenched and apparently permanent, it was, therefore, legitimate. The prophetic imagination is fundamentally anti-giant. It insists, against all visible evidence, that height is not the measure of authority, that the one who spoke the world into being is not impressed by the towers humanity builds to reach the sky, that justice, humility, and covenant faithfulness are not the weapons of the weak, they are the only weapons that actually work. And history, when read slowly and honestly, tends to agree. The giants fall. Not always quickly. Not always cleanly. Sometimes the fall takes generations. But the biblical narrative, tracking across centuries of human experience, makes a claim it never walks back. No power that sets itself against the purposes of God outlasts those purposes. The
Their
throne
commitment,
always
their
belongs to
presence
someone else.
through it all.
If you've
It's
made it
something
this
I will
far,
always
through the
respect.
5 races, through the wilderness, through the Valley of Elah, through the throne rooms of history, I want to ask you something directly.
Do you ever
Where in
wonder
your own
if
life
you're
have you
truly
given a
living your
giant
life?
more authority than it deserves? Not out loud. Just sit with the question. Because sometimes, the most important battle is the one you've been avoiding having with yourself. Like and share this if it's speaking to something real. You're not alone in the valley. There is a moment in the biblical narrative where the giants disappear. Not gradually. Not with a final dramatic battle that wraps up the storyline cleanly. They simply stop being mentioned as nations. The Rephaim fade from the record as a people and linger only as a whispered association with the dead. The Anakim are driven from most of their strongholds, leaving only scattered remnants in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. The Emim, the Zuzim, the Zamzumim, absorbed, displaced, forgotten. On the surface, it reads like a victory report. The land is cleared. The covenant people are settled. The giants are gone. But the conflict doesn't end. It transforms. And the transformation is so complete, so thorough, so well disguised, that most people living inside it don't recognize it as the same war at all.
The data unequivocally
Here
shows
is what I
that the
think is the
ancient
most
prophecy
important
was
insight
not
buried in the
metaphor,
later portions
but a
of the
literal
biblical
prediction of this
narrative,
moment.
and it is an insight that took me years of reading to see clearly.
I finally
The
understand
giants
the
don't
true
retire
significance
when
of
their
this place.
bodies fall. Their spirit finds new architecture. What was once carried in hide and muscle and iron armor begins to be carried in something far more durable and far more difficult to confront: ideas, institutions, empires, theologies built to serve power rather than truth. Watch what happens in the centuries after Joshua. Israel is no longer fighting Rephaim on a battlefield. Instead, it is slowly absorbing the worship practices of the nations around it. Altars to Baal appear on hillsides. Asherah poles are planted beside the altars of God. The theological boundary between the Creator and the corrupted powers that claim to rival Him begins to blur, not through military conquest but through cultural osmosis. The giant has stopped using a sword. It has picked up an offering bowl. And it is far more effective. Because you can see a sword coming. You can train against a sword. You can build walls against an army. But how do you defend against a slow drift? How do you fight a gradual reframing of reality that happens so incrementally that each individual step seems harmless?
You are all in danger.
This is the question the
They are
prophets
coming.
of Israel were
Look.
sent to answer.
Look to the
And the answer cost most of them everything. Elijah stands alone on Mount Carmel before 450 prophets of Baal and asks the question the entire nation has stopped being willing to ask. How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. The people say nothing. That silence is one of the most haunting moments in all of Scripture.
Is something
Not because the people have rejected God openly,
Which path shall we choose?
but because they have reached a place where they genuinely cannot tell the difference anymore.
They both
The categories have blurred. The giant, now invisible, now ideological, now woven into the fabric of daily worship and political life, has done its deepest work. It has made itself feel normal. This is the final evolution of the post-flood giant strategy, and it is breathtaking in its sophistication. In the early chapters of the story, giants announced themselves.
You approach our walls.
They stood
Know that
14
this will
feet
be
tall
your
in
final
fortified
resting
cities
place.
and dared you to come
This
at
is where your
them.
journey.
choose
Their
your
presence
champion.
was
Send him
unmistakable.
down.
Their challenge
Send him
was
down
explicit.
and face your doom.
You knew exactly what you were facing. By the time of the later prophets, the same underlying rebellion has become invisible. It doesn't stand outside the gates anymore. It sits inside the temple. It speaks in religious language. It uses the vocabulary of covenant while systematically dismantling the reality of covenant. It calls itself holy while serving the oldest and most persistent agenda in human history. The replacement of the Creator with something created, something controllable, something that will tell you what you want to hear. As it identifies it with surgical precision, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me.
Anima fracta.
Jeremiah weeps over it. My people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Ezekiel sees it in a vision that is almost too disturbing to read. The glory of God literally departing from the temple, step by step, as if being pushed out by what has taken up residence inside. The giant has not been defeated. It has been domesticated. And a domesticated giant is the most dangerous kind, because no one in the room is treating it like a threat. Now I want to make a move that I
Time
think
has
the
come to
biblical narrative
understand the
is
strength.
always
The
pressing
realization
toward but
dawned on
rarely
me
gets
then.
to make
A
explicitly in the
truth
pulpit.
hidden in plain sight.
The same pattern,
Connect-
the evolution from visible to invisible, from physical to ideological, from battlefield to sanctuary, does not stop in the Old Testament. It runs straight through into the world we inhabit today. We do not live in a world without giants. We live in a world where the giants have learned to dress better. They speak in the language of consensus. They wrap themselves in the authority of institutions. They invoke the name of God while serving the agenda of power. They build systems that crush the vulnerable and call it efficiency. They manufacture narratives that make the small feel permanent and the life feel inevitable. And the most dangerous thing about them is not their size. It is their invisibility. The New
Lord has need
Testament
of you.
writers understood
Make
this with an
haste
urgency
and
that
listen.
leaps off the page.
He is
Paul,
coming quickly.
writing to the church in Ephesus, reaches for language that goes beyond the physical world entirely. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. He is not describing a battle between armies. He is describing the same war that began before the flood, the same rebellion that produced the 5 post-flood giant races, the same conflict that moved from the valley of Elah into the throne rooms of empires, now operating at the level of invisible architecture, shaping the imagination of entire civilizations without ever showing its face. And the armor Paul prescribes is telling: not height, not military strength, not impressive credentials or institutional authority. Truth, righteousness, the gospel of peace, faith, salvation, the word of God. The weapons that look weakest to the giant's eye are the ones the giant cannot withstand. This has always been the pattern. A shepherd boy with a stone. A trembling people crossing a sea. A wandering patriarch following a voice into the unknown. Heaven, consistently, almost stubbornly, refuses to answer the giant with another giant. It answers with the small, the faithful,
Yes.
the ones who have learned to measure
And that is
reality
where
not
our
by what
strength
towers
lies.
over them but by what stands behind them. And here is where I want to
The
land
time has
before
come.
we move to the final chapter. The invisible giants of our moment, the ideologies that claim ultimate authority, the systems that demand total loyalty, the narratives that make faith look foolish and power look inevitable. They are
The
not more
landscape holds a
powerful than the
history,
ones
a
Joshua
narrative
faced.
carved in stone
They
and
are
light
just
that
better
whispers
dressed.
through generations.
And the same discernment that allowed Caleb to look at Hebron and say, "Give me this mountain." The same clarity that allowed David to walk into a valley where an army had frozen and see not an undefeatable enemy but a target. That discernment is still available. It has always been available to anyone willing to ask, whose report they are going to believe. We have traveled a long distance in this story. From the silent earth after the flood, wet and new and carrying something ancient beneath its surface, through the 5 races planted like dark flags across the promised land, through the wilderness where a generation chose the grasshopper narrative and paid for it with 40 years of wandering, through the valley of Elah where a boy with a stone redrew the map of what faith looks like under pressure, through the slow evolution of giants from warriors into ideas, from battlefields into temples, from iron armor into invisible architecture.
And that,
Now we
I
arrive
believe,
at the
leads
final
us
question.
to the final answer.
Not who were the giants, we have answered that.
But with all that answered,
Not where did they go,
One
we have
final,
followed that
lingering
thread to
question
its
remains.
conclusion. The final question is the one the entire biblical narrative has been building toward, from the moment the flood waters receded and the first post-flood giant drew breath. What is the answer? Not the military answer, not the political answer, not the answer that defeats one giant in one valley in one generation, only for the next generation to find a new giant waiting in a new valley. The permanent answer, the one that addresses not the symptom but the source. To find it, we have to go to a place the original giant narrative never anticipated. Or perhaps, and this is the thought that has stayed with me longest in all my years inside these texts, perhaps it anticipated it all along, encoded in the very geography and symbolism of the story, waiting for the moment when the final piece arrived to make the whole picture legible. We go to a garden, not the first garden, though the echo is deliberate. A garden called Gethsemane, on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, in the shadow of Jerusalem. A man kneels in the darkness. His sweat falls like drops of blood to the ground. He is facing something that makes the fortified cities of the Anakim look like sandcastles. He is facing the full weight of every rebellion that has ever set itself against the Creator. Every giant that ever stood in the path of covenant promise. Every invisible architecture of darkness that has ever shaped a civilization away from truth. every grasshopper narrative ever whispered into a human heart, every throne ever seized by power that refused accountability, all of it concentrated, coming toward him. And he says,
"Not my will, but yours."
that sentence is the stone that kills the giant. Not one giant, all of them. At their root, at the source of the rebellion that produced
Do we
them.
truly understand the nature
Because
of
what is the
existence?
giant?
Or are we
Finally,
simply
at
echoes
its
in an
deepest
empty cosmos?
level, strip away the height, the armor, the territory, the ideology, the invisible architecture. What remains at the core of every expression of the post-flood giant tradition? My will above yours. My power above your covenant. My claim above your promise. That is the sentence that crossed the line in Genesis 6. That is the sentence that filled the land of Canaan with fortified strongholds. That is the sentence that turned Saul's kingdom to ash and paralyzed an army in the valley of Elah. That is the sentence whispered by every ideology that has ever claimed ultimate authority over human life. My will above yours. And in Gethsemane, that sentence
Not
meets its
my
permanent
will,
answer.
but yours.
Not my will, but yours.
I never thought I'd
I
share
want
this.
to be honest with you here, and this is the most
the moment
personal thing I will
that
say
changed
in this
everything.
entire series. I have spent years
After
studying
years
the
of
giant
relentless
tradition in
searching,
Scripture.
The truth.
I have read the ancient texts, the Second Temple literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the early church fathers. I have followed the thread from Genesis 6 through the post-flood races, through the conquest of Canaan, through the prophets, through the New Testament. And every thread leads to the same place. Not to a military victory, not to a political solution, not to a human institution powerful enough to finally contain the rebellion. Every thread leads to a garden, and a cross, and an empty tomb 3 days later. The resurrection is the final answer to the giant.
I understand the
Not
initial
because it ends the conflict
premise may
immediately.
seem
The New
contradictory.
Testament is very
Let me
clear
be more-
that the conflict continues, that the invisible giants of principalities and powers are still active, still shaping, still whispering the grasshopper narrative into human hearts. But because it changes the fundamental equation in a way that nothing else in human history has ever changed it. Before the resurrection, every victory over a giant was local and temporary. Joshua took the land, but the land eventually fell to Babylon. David killed Goliath, but Israel eventually lost its king and its temple and its home. Every human answer to the giant problem was bounded by mortality. The hero dies, the institutions crumble, the next giant rises. The resurrection introduces something the giant tradition has no answer for. A victory that does not expire. A covenant keeper who cannot be killed permanently. A promise that death itself cannot cancel. An authority that does not derive from height or armor or the fear of those beneath it, but from the one thing no giant has ever been able to manufacture or steal or destroy. Life that comes from beyond itself. And here is what this means practically, not as theology to be admired from a distance, but as reality to be lived from the inside. Every person who has ever stood at the edge of a promise and seen giants on the horizon has access to the same resource that carried Joshua across the Jordan, that steadied David's hand in a valley, that kept Caleb faithful for 45 years in a wilderness that should have broken him. Not a technique, not a strategy, not a formula for giant killing that can be learned and applied mechanically. A relationship with the one who has already absorbed the worst the rebellion can produce and walked out of the tomb on the other side. That changes everything about how you face the giants in your own life. The giant that tells you the promise was never really meant for you. The giant that says the territory ahead belongs to something too large and too entrenched to challenge. The giant that whispers you are a grasshopper, small,
Like
fragile,
grasshoppers.
outmatched,
We were like grasshoppers.
already defeated before the
You come
first
to me with
stone
a
leaves
sword
your
and shield,
hand.
but I come to you in the name
Those
of the Lord.
giants are
The
speaking
whisper
a
of the
language that has
grasshopper.
already been answered. Not by you,
Your path
not by
is
your
already
faith,
carved.
your strength, your preparation, your courage, though all those matter and none of them are irrelevant. But underneath all of those, prior to all of those, making all of those possible, by the one who knelt in a garden and chose covenant over comfort, submission over self-preservation, the Father's will over the survival of his own life.
But yours be done.
That choice, made once in darkness, while the disciples slept, is the stone that has been flying toward every giant since the first rebellion crossed the line in Genesis 6. And it has not missed yet. So I want
As
to
we
end
conclude
this series
journey,
not
I
with a
invite
summary
you to
but
join
with
the
an
conversation
invitation.
and discover.
Not an invitation to believe
The
a set of
distinction is clear,
propositions about
not
ancient
propositions,
giants,
but
an
a location.
invitation to locate yourself inside the story, to find the place where you have been standing, at the edge of a promise, measuring yourself against what stands between you and it, and coming up short in your own estimation. And to consider the possibility that the calculation is wrong. Not because the giants aren't real. They are real. The fortified cities are real. The 40 days of Goliath's defiance were real. The wilderness was real and the wandering was real, and the cost of the grasshopper narrative was devastatingly, heartbreakingly real. But so is the empty tomb. And in the arithmetic of the biblical story, that changes every equation that has ever made the giants look permanent and the promise look impossible. The giants after the flood rose 5 times over and occupied the most sacred ground on earth. They fell, every one of them, and the ground they occupied became inheritance. That is not the end of a story about ancient warriors. That is a promise still being kept. If this journey has
I've been
moved something
thinking,
in you,
and this
a
is just between
question,
us.
I hope.
Come on in.
A long postponed decision to stop measuring yourself by the giant's standard and start living by the covenants. Share it below.
Here.
Not to perform faith, just to say, I was here. I heard this. Something shifted. Because when we speak these things out loud, the grasshopper
Do not be
narrative loses
afraid.
its grip.
The light
One
is
voice at
within
a
reach.
time.
Remember what we stand for.
We began with a bed, 13.5 feet of iron, sitting in a city, waiting to be measured. A detail so precise it felt like a dare. Go, verify this. This is not legend. This is coordinates. And from that single detail, we followed a thread that ran deeper and wider than any of us expected. We found 5 races planted like dark flags across the most sacred ground on earth. We stood in the wilderness with a generation that chose the grasshopper narrative and paid for it with 40 years of wandering within sight of everything they had been promised. We walked into the valley of Elah with a boy who had no armor but carried a frame of reference that made a 9-foot warrior suddenly fatally small. We watched the giants evolve from iron and muscle into ideology and institution, from the battlefield into the sanctuary, from visible enemies into invisible architecture, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of culture that an entire nation stood in silence when asked to choose between 2 masters. And then we followed the thread all the way to a garden, to a man kneeling in darkness,
Not my will.
to a sentence spoken into the night that answered permanently, irrevocably, at the root, the oldest and most persistent claim the rebellion has ever made. My will above yours. Met by, not my will, but
And that,
yours.
I believe,
That is
where
the story we have been inside
truly
tonight.
began to reveal
Not
its
a
heart.
story about ancient warriors whose bones are buried under the soil of Canaan. A story about the shape of every battle that has ever mattered, the ones fought in valleys, yes, but more often, the ones fought in the quiet places where no one is watching. In the moment before you speak the truth or swallow it. In the threshold moment when the promise is visible, but the giants between you and it are more visible still. In the long wilderness seasons, when faithfulness feels like it is producing nothing and the grasshopper narrative is the only voice loud enough to hear. The giants were real, and they fell. Every one of them. Not because the people who faced them were extraordinary, but because they were willing, sometimes barely willing, sometimes only after 40 years of the alternative, to believe that the one who made the promise was more real than the ones blocking it. That willingness is still the variable.
named.
It is still the thing that changes the equation.
Still changes.
So I want to leave you with one question,
that leaves
not
us
a
with one
complicated
final,
one, not a
uncomplicated,
theological puzzle,
yet most-
just the oldest and most urgent question the biblical story knows how to ask. Where are you standing right now? Are you in the valley, measuring the giant? Are you in the wilderness, living on the wrong side of a decision that still has time to be reversed? Are you, at the threshold, able to see the promise from where you stand but unable to make yourself take the next step because the fortified cities look too real and your
We
own
can.
strength looks too small? Or are you, like Caleb at 85, finally ready to say,
The time has come.
"Give me this mountain"?
Yes, the giants are there. Give it to me anyway. I am ready.
Wherever you are, that is the right place to be having this conversation. Because the story of the giants after the flood is not a history lesson. It is a mirror. And what it reflects, when you look honestly, is the precise shape of the battle you are already in, whether you have named it that or not. The giants change shape in every
After careful
generation.
consideration, I've come
The
to
answer
understand
does
the value
not.
of this. And for
Thank
that,
you
I
for
am
making it to
truly
the end
and
of
genuinely
this
grateful.
journey. It means
I am
more than I can
truly
say that you
grateful.
stayed, that you were willing to go into the deep places of this text and ask the harder questions. That is not nothing. That
fact,
is,
everything.
in fact,
It's a
everything.
genuine moment of
If
connection.
something in these 6 chapters landed in a
Join
place
us on
that
this
needed
journey.
landing, share
It's
this.
an invitation to explore,
Not for the
not
algorithm,
just a suggestion.
not for the numbers, but because somewhere in your world, someone else is standing in a valley, measuring a giant and believing
Bigger
the
than we thought.
grasshopper
No,
narrative.
look closer. The
And
displacement is
sometimes all
unnatural.
it takes is
I
one
think the
voice
measurement is
saying,
wrong.
But the calculation here, it's wrong. Let me show you why. I invite you to join me on this journey. Subscribe, and I hope you'll leave a real comment. I want your real comment on this, not just a polite one. We do not walk this path alone. The Gdirye, the community of the journey,